The American Civil War is probably the defining event in American history. Even more so than the War of Independence at stake was the continued existence of the country that evolved from the one created by the 13 original colonies to become a giant, encompassing the entire continent from east to west, and the very nature of that country, free or slave-owning. Its battles and generals left an indelible mark on American life, in the North and the South, and maintained their fascination for millions, despite the almost century and a half that has passed since the silence of the guns. The first question that arises for anyone attempting to write a clear account of this conflict is how to organize the material. The sheer scale of the war over 4 years and the numerous theaters of war could be overwhelming. This author has chosen to take advantage of a recognized weakness in the plans of both the Union and the Confederates: the tendency to plan on a regional basis. It was rare for operations in one theater of war to be planned in a way that directly influenced events in another, and even when this did happen, the distances between the theaters meant that this influence was usually indirect. This article will exploit this tendency and analyze each major theater of war separately, noting only where there is overlap. We will begin with a brief overview of the events of each year. 1861. The most significant characteristic of the fighting in the first year of the war was that it proved the Confederacy would not collapse at the first blow, and that the Union was willing to fight. The first shots were fired in April at Fort Sumter, a Federal position in Charleston Harbor. After the fall of Fort Sumter to the Confederacy, both sides devoted themselves to building their armies. The year would be marked by many battles, but only one truly important one. In the summer, Lincoln was under great pressure to use the newly formed Union Army to invade Virginia. Had this first invasion been successful, the Civil War might have been much shorter. As it was, after a hard-fought battle, First Battle of Bull Run, or First Battle of Manassas, July 21st, Confederate reinforcements settled the matter, and the Union Army fled the battlefield. The war would not end in 1861. 1862. The second year of the war witnessed the Union's first major successes in the West. The winter campaign Grant's expedition along the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers resulted in the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and opened vast areas of the Confederacy to Union attack. A Confederate counterattack was defeated in Shiloh, April 6 to 7th, leading to the Union occupation of most of western Tennessee. One Confederate counterattack in eastern Kentucky ended after encountering a much larger Union force, Perryville, October 8, although the final battle of the campaign, Stones River/Murfreesboro, December 31st to January 2nd, 1863, damaged both armies enough to halt any active campaigning in the area for 6 months. Along the Mississippi, the Union also had a successful year. In the North, the Confederate stronghold on 10th Island was captured on April 7th, and Memphis, Tennessee, fell on June 6th. In the South, New Orleans, the largest Confederate city, fell in April. Only the stretch of the river between Vicksburg and Port Hudson remained in Confederate hands. In the East, the Confederacy prevailed in the fighting that year. In the Shenandoah Valley, Stonewall Jackson waged a classic campaign, in which he defeated or outmaneuvered a series of Union armies, allowing him to move his army to Richmond in time to help contain the main Union attack that year. This attack was the Peninsula Campaign. General McClellan attempted to bypass the strong Confederate positions in northern Virginia by sending his army to the peninsula east of Richmond, hoping to outflank the Confederate armies and capture their capital. Unfortunately, this plan required courage and speed, two qualities McClellan lacked. During the 7 days battles, June 25th to July 1st, the Union won all but one battle, but McClellan still withdrew from the vicinity of Richmond. With the withdrawal of the Union Army from the peninsula, General Robert E. Lee, he was able to achieve the first of his great triumphs. The Union Army in northern Virginia suddenly became vulnerable to attack, as the slow retreat allowed Lee to move some of his troops from Richmond northward. Second Battle of Bull Run/Second Battle of Manassas, August 29th to 30th. He orchestrated a major victory over much of the Union Army. This victory allowed Lee to launch his first invasion of the North, which he hoped would convince the Northern public that they had no hope of winning. This invasion failed miserably. Soon after crossing into Maryland, with his army divided, Lee was defeated at Antietam, September 17th, and only McClellan's poor handling of the battle saved the Confederate Army from total destruction. The year ended with a second triumph for Lee. The new Union commander, General Burnside, he was not suited to command an entire army and suffered a major defeat at Fredericksburg, December 13th, after launching a frontal assault against fortified Confederate positions. 1863. Once again, Union armies won significant victories in the West. In Mississippi, Vicksburg was the last Confederate link between the East and the West. After a series of failed attempts to reach south of the city during the winter of 1862-63, General Grant launched his successful attack in the spring of 1863. After passing with his fleet through Vicksburg's guns, he launched a campaign on the east bank of the Mississippi that defeated the Confederate forces that had gathered to help defend the city. After a formal siege, Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th. 5 days later, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, Port Hudson, also surrendered, and the Union gained control of the entire river. Further east, Union forces finally captured Chattanooga, Tennessee, but were soundly defeated shortly afterward at Chickamauga, August 19th to 20th. Just across the Georgia border, the defeated Union forces were besieged at Chattanooga until the end of November. General Grant, now commanding all Union forces in the Western Theater of Operations, assumed personal command of the besieged troops. After a series of preparatory battles, the besieging Confederate Army was defeated in Missionary Ridge, November 25th, paving the way for Sherman's attack on Atlanta the following year. In the East, things did not go so well for the Union. Another new Union commander, Joe Hooker, proved incapable of performing the role. This time, at least, he had a plan, hoping to use his numerical superiority to corner Lee, but he lacked the ability and courage to execute it. At Chancellorsville, May 2nd to 5th, 1863, Lee inflicted another crushing defeat on a Union army, but again was unable to destroy it. Lee resumed his 1862 plan, an invasion of the North. This time, he entered Pennsylvania, hoping to capture another Chancellorsville, but on Northern soil. His hope was that a major Confederate victory in the North would convince Northern public opinion that the Confederacy could not be defeated. Unlike in 1862, this time Lee managed to win the battle with his army intact, but, just as in 1862, he did not achieve victory. Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, was one of the most important battles of the war in the East, ending Lee's hopes of invading the North and beginning the process of attrition that would eventually destroy his army. 1864. The North finally found a general capable of standing up to Lee. Ulysses S. Grant was transferred from the West to assume overall command of the Union armies. He focused his personal attention on the Virginia campaign, while his friend William T. Sherman was sent to invade Georgia, and Sheridan he was assigned to devastate the Shenandoah Valley. Grant and Sherman began their main campaigns in May. Sherman's mission was to advance south from Chattanooga to attack the Confederate Army in Tennessee, under the command of Joseph Johnston, and capture Atlanta, Georgia, one of the major remaining Confederate cities. Johnston conducted a skillful campaign, preventing Sherman from destroying his army and ceding territory in exchange for time. It took Sherman more than 2 months to reach Atlanta. Johnston was then replaced by John Hood, who, after attempting to defeat Sherman in battle, was forced to retreat to the defenses of Atlanta. Finally, at the end of August, Sherman's men managed to cut the last railroad line that provided access to Atlanta, and Hood was forced to abandon the city. Sherman's men entered Atlanta on September 2nd. After capturing the city, Sherman's army spent 2 frustrating months defending its narrow northward railroad line against Hood's attacks. During this time, Sherman came to believe that his next move should be to abandon his supply line and march eastward toward the coast, surviving off the land. This would take the war to previously untouched areas of the Confederacy. Hood helped Sherman gain approval for his plan by advancing northward in an invasion of Tennessee, where his army was virtually annihilated. On November 15th, Sherman set sail from Atlanta on his famous march to the sea. As they crossed Georgia, his men left a trail of devastation throughout the state, seizing or destroying anything of military value to the Confederacy. They arrived in Savannah, Georgia, on the Atlantic coast, shortly before Christmas. A similar campaign of devastation was also carried out in the Shenandoah Valley, which until then had been a major source of strength for the Confederacy. In August, General Sheridan was placed in command of the Union forces in the valley, with instructions to turn it into a wilderness, denying supplies to Lee. On the outskirts of Richmond, the outnumbered Confederate forces failed to repeat the successes of Stonewall Jackson in 1862, and by the end of the year, the Shenandoah Valley had ceased to have any value to the Confederacy. While Sheridan and Sherman were achieving clear successes, Grant was engaged in the much slower process of destroying Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. He began his campaign in May, hoping to outmaneuver Lee and force his surrender. But, should that fail, he was prepared to continue fighting around Richmond until Lee's army was physically annihilated. Lee was too skilled, and his army too experienced, for Grant to achieve his goal. In a series of battles, among them, Wilderness, May 4th to 8th, Spotsylvania, from May 10th to 12th, and Cold Harbor, from May 31st to June 3 RD, Grant repeatedly attempted to flank Lee, but was thwarted several times. Finally, from June 15th to 18th, the Union Army lost its chance to capture Petersburg and isolate Richmond from the rest of the South. Grant's armies prepared for a formal siege. The true significance of this struggle was that Grant kept advancing. The first battle, at Wilderness in May, nearly resulted in a Confederate victory, and it was the kind of battle that might have led other Union generals to abandon their plans. Grant was not one of those generals. He knew that Lee could not afford the casualties he was suffering, and that, if Grant continued advancing, the Army of Northern Virginia would eventually be decimated. 1865. The final year of the war was marked by significant actions in two areas. On February 1st, Sherman's men began their march north through South Carolina. The state capital, Columbus, fell on February 17th. After devastating a vast area of South Carolina, Sherman's army entered North Carolina, where it fought the only major battles of the campaign, Aversboro, March 16th, and Bentonville, March 19th. By this time, Sherman's men had advanced so far north that, on March 25th, their commander was able to leave them to meet with Grant and plan their participation in the final campaign of the war. In the vicinity of Richmond and Petersburg, it became evident that Grant's armies had accomplished their mission in 1864. Lee began the year aware that he no longer had the strength to maintain the siege, unless he did something drastic to alter the situation. He planned to launch one more attack on the Union lines, and then take advantage of the resulting confusion to withdraw his army from Richmond and Petersburg. He would lead it south, join forces opposing Sherman, defeat his army, and return to defeat Grant with the newly combined army. On March 25th, Lee launched his attack against Fort Stedman. After some initial success, the Confederate attack was repelled with heavy casualties. Grant then finally planned an attack along the entire railroad line. As preparation, he sent Sheridan to capture the last railroad line that provided access to Petersburg. 5 Forks. April 1st, the Confederate defenders of this strategic position were decimated. At 10 a.m. on April 2nd, Grant launched his final assault against the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg. 6 hours later, Lee ordered President Davis to evacuate Richmond, and the following day Federal troops entered the city, as did President Lincoln, who was nearby, awaiting the moment. Lee managed to rescue part of his army from the trap, but his only option was to march west in the hope of finding a railroad still in Confederate hands that he could use to advance south. There was none. On April 9th, 1865, Grant and Lee met at Appomattox Courthouse and agreed on the terms of surrender for the Army of Northern Virginia. With Lee's departure, the rest of the Confederacy soon followed suit. Joseph Johnston in North Carolina surrendered on April 26th, and Edmund Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi region on May 26th. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stand Watie. A month later, the Civil War had finally ended, just over 4 years after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Lowe's exact casualty figures were collected for the Union, but Confederate records were poorly preserved or lost in the chaos of defeat. Thus, casualty figures are imprecise and based on statistical extrapolation. Neither side kept a record of civilian deaths due to the war. In the 19th century, the number of deaths was estimated at 620,000. In 2011, the number of deaths was recalculated based on a 1% sample of census data, resulting in approximately 750,000 soldier deaths, 20% more than traditionally estimated, and possibly reaching 850,000. The number was recalculated to 698,000 soldier deaths in 2024, after analysis of recently made available complete census records. Mortality rates among men reached 19% in Louisiana and 16.6 to 16.7% in Georgia and South Carolina, respectively. The war resulted in at least 1,030,000 casualties, 3% of the population, including approximately 698,000 soldier deaths, 2/3 from disease. Based on 1860 census data, 8% of all white males aged 13 to 43 died in the war, including 6% in the North and 18% in the South. Approximately 56,000 soldiers died in prisoner-of-war camps during the war. An estimated 60,000 soldiers lost limbs. As James M. McPherson notes, the cost of the war in American lives was as great as that of all the nation's other wars combined, up to the Vietnam War. Of the 359,528 Union Army dead, representing 15% of the more than 2 million who served, 110,070 were killed in combat, 67,000, or died as a result of their wounds, 43,000. 199,790 people died from disease, 75% due to the war. The rest would have occurred in civilian life anyway. 24,866 people died in Confederate prisoner-of-war camps. 9,058 people died in accidents or from drowning. 15,741 other deaths/deaths of unknown cause. In addition, there were 4,523 deaths in the Navy, 2,112 in combat, and 460 in the Marine Corps, 148 in combat.